Thank you. And tonight I'm here to welcome you to your National Museum of American History, and thank you very much for joining us. We welcome and thank Secretary Albright, the first woman to serve as Secretary of State. The genius of America comes in many diverse forms: gender, country of origin, and the amazing perspective of our naturalized citizens. We have gathered to celebrate a person of many firsts, and her most iconic objects are already part of the national collection at this museum. And tonight's first is that Secretary Albright is the first recipient of the National Museum of American History's Great Americans Medal. Thank you to our 13th Secretary, Dr. David Skorton, a polymath who insists that we convene the most important conversations that drive the nation and our world to bold new places and insights. And thank you to our Alumni Board member and Smithsonian Regent, David Rubenstein. We appreciate and celebrate his astounding generosity, intellectual focus, and deep understanding of how important it is for American history to be visible and utterly interesting to all of us. David, you're a voracious reader with a burning appetite for understanding and sharing why history matters. And beginning with your work at the White House, you've made American history, and we are now privileged that you are our interviewer to illuminate a great history maker. We thank our board member and renowned numismatist, Jeff Garrett, who commissioned and donated this extraordinary gold medal, which we'll be presenting tonight, inspired by the 1905 $20 double eagle designed by the famed sculptor St. Gaudens. The national treasure is actually on display on the first floor of the museum. Your National Museum is dedicated to exploring the ideals and ideas of America to create the most engaging, interesting, and inclusive American history that helps people understand the past, to make sense of the present, and shape a more humane future. And to transform American history and the National Museum, literally, we're in the midst of a 15-year, $600 million reinvention of every facet of our work. Next June, we will open our new wing dedicated to the nation we build together, which addresses the most pressing issues of our time, the fundamental question of, what does it mean to be American? Our two keystone exhibitions, American Democracy, A Great Leap of Faith, and Many Voices, One Nation, on the peopling of America, demonstrate how we must all be active participants in our vibrant democracy and how our many communities have negotiated with one another to form our nation. And there is much more. We're in the new Hall of Music, the home of our other acclaimed music program, the Smithsonian Chamber Music Society, all exploring what it means to be American. So, who is a great American and why? Tonight, we will learn more about America's ideals and ideas from this conversation between David Rubenstein and Secretary Albright.
From a young immigrant fleeing war and dictatorship to America's top diplomat.
I, Madeleine Albright.
Representing our ideals and ideas around the world. Madeleine K. Albright has always broken boundaries.
We invite everyone to help us and caution each that they cannot stop us.
Born in what was then Czechoslovakia on the eve of World War II, her family fled their home twice as political refugees. And at the age of 11, Madeleine arrived at Ellis Island on the boat SS America. The United States would become the country where she would make history. Madeleine inherited an interest in world affairs from her father, a former Czech diplomat and a STEAM professor. She earned a degree in political science at Wellesley College. Here, Madeleine made what she called the most important decision of her life. She decided to become a naturalized U.S. citizen. She raised 3 daughters while studying to earn her PhD from Columbia University. After working in Washington political circles for over a decade, she stepped onto the world stage in 1993 as the U.S. Permanent Representative to the United Nations.
At this time of turmoil and hope, this assignment is a major challenge.
At the UN, she knew how to win over allies and, when necessary, needle the opposition.
So there was a poem that came out in the newspapers in Baghdad that compared me to an unparalleled serpent. And I happened to have a snake pin, so I wore it when we talked about Iraq. And then I thought, well, this is fun. So I went out and I bought a bunch of pins. When people said, what are we going to do today? I said, read my pins.
In 1997, Madeleine made history when President Bill Clinton named her our first female Secretary of State.
Congratulations, Madam Secretary.
She broke a critical glass ceiling and at that time became the highest-ranking woman in the U.S. government.
As the history of this century and the story of my life bear witness, the United States is truly the world's indispensable nation.
Tirelessly traveling the globe, she tackled the legacies of the turbulent 20th century.
As the new millennium begins, this will remain our greatest challenge, not unlocking the secrets of science, but learning the fundamental lesson of our kinship with each other.
Today, Madeleine shapes the next generation of diplomats as a professor at Georgetown University's School of Foreign Service. And she continues to support fledgling democratic institutions and activists abroad. Secretary Albright donated items from her diplomatic career to the Smithsonian's National Museum of American History.
To Secretary Christopher, I can only hope that my heels can fill your shoes.
Welcoming new Americans at a citizenship ceremony, where they took the same oath that she did as a young student. A barrier-breaking diplomat who championed America's values abroad, Madeleine K. Albright is a great American. Her story is a part of American history.
Please welcome the 64th United States Secretary of State, Madeleine K. Albright, and Smithsonian Regent David Rubenstein.
So you're known the world around as Madeleine Albright, but Madeleine really wasn't your birth name. How did you get a non-Czech name like Madeleine?
Well, first of all, my name is Maria Jana Korbelova. And this is a very weird story. My grandmother, apparently there was a play in Prague at the time that I was a little girl, and it was called Madeleine in the Brick Factory. She decided that the name Madeleine was a good name. However, my mother never pronounced anything right, and I was Madeleine, and I had no idea how to spell it. And it was not until I went to school in Switzerland that they decided that my name was Madeleine, spelled the French way. But my legal name is still Maria Jana. And when I got my first passport issued, I would, in fact, you know, where you have to sign your name, I'd always put Madeleine, and they'd say, this is not you. And I said, but it is. And so it was not until I was Secretary of State and I could actually order up a passport that said Madeleine.
So when you became Secretary of State, what did you feel more pride in, the fact that you were the first woman to be Secretary of State, or you were a naturalized citizen, or how do you compare the comparative pleasures?
It's hard to separate. I mean, I did love being a first, and being a woman was obviously a big breakthrough, and very proud of that. But the fact that I could be Secretary of State as a refugee and a naturalized American was a really big deal. But I have to tell you, the first person to call me to congratulate me was Henry Kissinger. And he said, Madeleine, you have taken away my one unique characteristic of being an immigrant Secretary of State. And I said, no, Henry, I don't have an accent. So, yeah. He did say, by the way, welcome to the fraternity. And I said, it isn't that either anymore.
So When you were starting out in the foreign policy world, did you ever think a woman would be Secretary of State?
No, it never occurred to me. And frankly, well, I had no choice but to be in the foreign policy world. As the video really explained, my father, all we ever talked about at home was foreign policy in some form or another. And I loved it, and I really saw it very much as a man's world. However, I had gone to a girls' high school and to Wellesley, and so there really was no question that women actually could do everything. But it had not occurred to me, and not because I lacked ambition, but basically I'd never seen a woman Secretary of State, so I didn't think it could happen.
So is it a regret of your life that your father didn't live to see you become Secretary of State?
Yes, very much so.
He died when you were at in the Senate?
77 he died, so I was in the Senate.
When you became Secretary of State, did other people, like Henry Kissinger, who had been Secretary of State, did they give you some advice about what you should do as Secretary of State?
Well, I sought advice, and I very much enjoyed talking to my predecessors to really find out what the job was about. And they each had something different to say, but they did say that it is one of the most amazing, best jobs in the world, and I clearly agree with them. And we continue to be a very close group of people that have had that honor and responsibility to sit behind a sign that says United States.
You were succeeded by Colin Powell. Did you give him any advice, anything relating to emails or anything else? No?
Well, I gratefully preceded technology. What I did give him advice about, which is very interesting, Colin and I, by the way, are really good friends, and we had a few arguments when he was chairman of the Joint Chiefs and I was at the United Nations, but I basically told him that he couldn't drive his own car all the time, and that diplomatic security would not appreciate that. So we talked about those kinds of things.
Okay, let's go back to your childhood a moment. You're born in Czechoslovakia, and your father is in the Foreign Service of Czechoslovakia. Then there were some concerns about the Nazis ultimately taking over Czechoslovakia as they did. So how did your family manage to escape from Czechoslovakia?
My father was a diplomat, and he was press attaché in Belgrade when I was born. My mother wanted me to be born in Prague because of her mother, so I was born in Prague, and then they went back to Belgrade. My mother was the most wonderful, delightful person that said exactly what she had on her mind. And after Munich, when the Czechoslovaks didn't fight, I learned this story much later, was that she, at a dinner party in Belgrade, said, "I would rather be married to a street cleaner than a soldier who doesn't fight." They were then withdrawn back to Prague. So my parents were in Prague when the Nazis came in 1939. And again, I only learned this from some things that my mother had written, which was that my father was trying to figure out how to get out because he wanted to go and be with the government in exile. And they put me with my grandmother while they went and spent the night in different places all the time. Ultimately, my mother wrote that as a result of some bribery, my father did get a visa and got out. And they got out via Yugoslavia to London, where my father joined the government in exile.
Okay, so you're living in London, and you're about 10 years old then, or something like that?
No,
Younger?
3.
You're
Well,
young-
we
you're-
lived in
you're-
London
right.
from 1939
Okay.
to 45, so. Yeah.
So you lived through the bombing of London, and what was that like?
Well, it was interesting because we lived, now Notting Hill Gate is very fancy, but it was basically an area for refugees. And we lived in a big apartment, I remember this, a big apartment building where we went into the cellar during air raids. And my father broadcast for BBC. One of the things that he did as a part of his job was to do the Czechoslovak service from BBC. I used to think he actually lived in the radio. But he would say, and I remember him saying, "I don't know why we go down there to this cellar because there are hot water pipes and gas pipes down there anyway." When I was doing research for my books, I went back to the place and I went to the apartment, and then I actually asked a stupid question like, is the cellar still there? So I went there, and all of a sudden I had that moment that I recognized the same old green paint that had been there. After the Blitz, we actually moved out to Walton-on-Thames and lived there. My father was an air raid warden. We had they had these big steel tables that were called Morrison tables that apparently, they said, could protect you during an air raid attack. And so we slept under the table, we ate on the table, I played around the table, and I spent a lot of time in air raid shelters waiting for the all clear sign.
So ultimately, when the war is over, you're living in London. Why did your family decide to go back to Czechoslovakia? Was it not clear that the communists were going to take over and your father wasn't a communist?
No, and what happened, I mean, my father was very young, frankly, and he was kind of one of the assistants to Jan Masaryk, who became the foreign minister. He went back on the first plane, and as far as I know, I mean, I was 8 years old, it never occurred to them that they wouldn't go back. And so my father went on the first airplane with Beneš back to Prague, and then my mother, my cousin, and I, my younger sister, followed. And it was not clear that the communists were going to win. It was a coalition government at the time. What was interesting was Jan Masaryk became the foreign minister. His deputy was a man called Vlado Klementis, who was a communist. The communists had done very well in the election of 1946. And it really was a coalition government at the time and operated that way until February 1948.
At that point, your father decided to take the family out of Czechoslovakia, but why did he not go back to London, which was more convenient? Why did you go to the United States?
Well, more complicated than that. What happened was he was a professional diplomat, and so his 3-year time as a diplomat was up in Belgrade. And by the way, if I might say this, my father didn't want me going to school with communists. And so I had a governess. And in Yugoslavia, I spent all my time in the embassy, and I had a governess. I didn't have a lot of friends. But I got kind of ahead of myself a little bit. And in Europe, you can't go to the next phase until you're a certain age. So my parents sent me to Switzerland. So I went to school in Switzerland when I was 10, and they were in Belgrade. So kind of the stories about the end there, I've gotten from reading my father's books. And his 3-year term was up, and it was time for a new assignment. So his assignment was to be a member of a new commission to do with India and Pakistan over Kashmir. He wanted to have the assignment, and then what happened was the communists took over. His best friends in Belgrade were the British and American ambassadors, and they said, your country's just had a coup. If you resign, they'll name some communist to take your place. But if you report to our governments, we can actually get something done. And so he made that decision. They pretended that my mother was going back to Prague and picking me up in Switzerland, and my brother and sister by them, and while my father went to India. We went to the United States because he was working for the United Nations, and we came I have no tragic story about climbing through barbed wire. We came on the SS America on diplomatic passports and went and lived on Long Island because the UN was at Lake Success. So that was the story.
But at some point, your father would lose his diplomatic
He
passport.
defected. What happened was he decided he did not want to work for the communists, and he defected and asked for political asylum. And when I went into office, I was given the papers in which he had written to Dean Acheson begging, I beg for a political asylum. And he was given political asylum. It was a stage he was stateless and jobless. And the Rockefeller Foundation at that stage found jobs for Central European intellectuals or something. And they found him a job at the University of Denver. And we had no idea where Denver was. And my parents bought a car. We started driving across America. And my mother said, they say Denver's the mile-high city, but we're not going up, so maybe we're going the wrong direction. Anyway, we ended up in Denver. My father started teaching at the University of Denver actually had a whole international department. It was called the Social Science Foundation. And he started teaching. He became a professor. And he used to say, there is nothing better than being a professor in a free country.
Okay, so you had a perfect British or American accent at that time, and you became more of an American accent. Is that right?
We had arrived on Long Island November 11th, 1948. So we had Thanksgiving came up, and we were singing. We gathered together to ask God's blessing. And I heard somebody asking, and I thought, who's asking? And I had been asking, and from then on I asked.
Okay.
And
So you weren't wealthy, but your father was a professor, and you went to a private school in Denver, an all-girls school, and then you applied to lots of colleges, and you got in everywhere you applied. How come you decided to go to Wellesley?
we really were refugees. And my parents, we lived in lots of different houses in Denver, and when I go there now, I love to give the tour of the various places we lived in. And people were very nice. They brought presents for us, and there was a girls' school in Denver where my father insisted that I go, and I went on scholarship. There were only 16 girls in our graduating class. And what happened was I couldn't go to college unless I got a scholarship. And I chose Wellesley. First of all, I'd seen Wellesley, and it appealed to me tremendously, but my English teacher and my Latin teacher had gone to Wellesley, and they loved it. And so the last weekend was kind of a choice between Stanford and Wellesley, and I'm very glad that I chose Wellesley because my whole life would have been different.
Well, if you'd gone to Stanford, you ever told the Stanford people they'd given you more financial aid, you might have gone there?
But I'll tell you what actually did happen, which made me think my life was going to be a disaster. Stanford always gives their responses earlier than the others, and I got accepted, and there was no scholarship, and I ran out of the house screaming, saying that my life was over. My father came to find me, and the people at the school said, well, it's very unfortunate that they didn't give you a scholarship because it's kind of a sign that how the other schools will feel. I then got letters from all the others with scholarships, and Wellesley and Stanford said that I had gotten a scholarship from the Colorado Stanford Club. It had just come in a different letter. And then the head of the school said, it's really so too bad that you applied to so many schools and you're only going to one. That will not help your classmates. So I was not very happy about that.
So you went to Wellesley, and you did what a lot of women of that age did. You got married the day you graduated, more or less. Is that right?
3 days.
3 days afterwards. Okay. You then moved with your husband to?
First to the Army in Missouri, and then in Chicago. But one of the things that happened at Wellesley was I had gone to school in Denver, and everybody at that stage wore Bermuda shorts and Shetland sweaters. And at Wellesley, they had this system where if somebody came to visit you, they would announce it all through the corridors. And so they said, Madeleine Corbell, there are some ladies here who want to take you into Boston to show you what the American girl wears. So I go down and dressed, and they said, well, you are a foreign student here. And I said, yes, that's true. And then I belonged to something that they called the Cosmopolitan Club, and I found out that a third had been American students, but I was there as a foreign student. So when I went to ask about how I'd done on my SAT scores and stuff, they'd say, amazing. And I didn't know whether it was because they thought I was a foreign student. But I didn't become a citizen until I was at Wellesley between my sophomore and junior year. Anyway, I did get married 3 days after graduating. I wanted to be a journalist. My husband was a journalist. And while he was in the Army at Fort Leonard Wood, Missouri, I worked on a small newspaper. And then he already had a job in Chicago, so then we moved to Chicago. And we're having dinner with his managing editor, and he says, so what are you going to do, honey? I said, I'm going to work on a newspaper. And he said, I don't think so. You can't work on the same paper as your husband because of labor regulations. And even though there were 3 other papers in Chicago at the time, he said, and you wouldn't want to compete with your husband, so go find another life. And the bottom line is, I know what I'd say today, but then
You ever run into that person after you were Secretary of State? No.
What?
You ever run into that person
No,
after
I
you were
don't.
Secretary of State?
But what I did do, I went to work for Encyclopedia Britannica. For some of the younger people here, it's a book. Right. It was really because I had foreign policy background, and they used to review the articles every year, different segment. They were doing geographical articles, so they figured my foreign policy background would allow me to choose the illustrations for geographical articles. So that was the beginning of my career.
Ultimately, you migrated to Washington with your husband.
Yeah.
And you began getting involved with your children's school and getting involved in a lot of volunteer activities, and that led to getting involved with some political fundraising. How did that come about?
Well, I had been put in charge of fundraising at Beauvoir School, and I did it with another person who was the parent, and we raised a lot of money. And he was from Maine, and he was asked to chair a big fundraising dinner for Ed Muskie, April 17th, 1972, and he knew that I had done all the work. So he asked me to co-chair it with him. And it was my first experience at fundraising, and also my first experience at one of the more peculiar historical events. So we had this dinner at the Capitol Hilton, and I get there. The first phone call was from the Embassy of Chad, saying that the campaign managers had invited the charge to the dinner, and when were we sending the limousine? I put the people on hold. I called up Burl Bernhardt and George Mitchell, and I said, what about this? And they said, well, we didn't invite him, but if he wants to come, fine, but we don't have any limousines. So in the course of the day, we had floral arrangements delivered COD, and pizzas delivered COD, and liquor delivered COD, and I kept sending everything back. And then there was the VIP cocktail party. All of a sudden, there's this couple that comes in, swathed in batik, and I say, so you are from the Embassy of Chad? And the man said, no, I'm the ambassador from Kenya. Within 10 minutes, we had 24 African ambassadors that had been invited. It was a completely seated dinner, so we had to rearrange so we didn't have just tables of black ambassadors. And then there was a couple that came in and said, we are magicians, having been invited by a man that name you might remember, Henry Kimmelman, and that they had been invited to perform for the children. And I said, this is not a children's party. And they said, but we were invited. And I said, I'm sorry, it's not. And the man says to me, so didn't I tell you I was a magician? And I said, yes. And he said, if you don't let me in, I'm going to turn you into something terrible. So we let him in. The bottom line is that during the Watergate hearings, they admitted to all of this being part of the dirty tricks. And the only thing that the guy said was that he hadn't sent elephants, if they'd sent elephants. So that was my first political experience.
But ultimately, Ed Muskie liked what you must have done for him, and he offered you a job on the Capitol Hill staff that he had?
Yeah, this was after the '76 campaign. I had done some stuff for him in Maine, and then I became his chief legislative assistant, which I loved.
Then Jimmy Carter gets elected president, and your former professor at Columbia, where you'd gotten a PhD, gets the job as National Security Advisor, Zbig Brzezinski, and you're hoping that he might offer you a job, or what happened?
He called me over the Christmas holidays, and he said, Madeleine, perhaps you've heard I've been named National Security Advisor. I said, yes, I've heard that. And he said, will you find me a place to live? And I said, geez, Big, I thought you were calling to offer me a job. And he said, no, I'm calling you to ask me to find a place to live. So I did. And then I didn't go. He asked me in 1978 to come to the White House and work doing congressional relations, which is when I met you.
Right, and but there was no such job before in charge of congressional relations at the NSC staff, so what did you really do?
That's what I did. It was interesting because first of all, I loved the job. And I had a choice, which you will understand, is between having a fancy office in the old executive office building or literally a closet in the West Wing. And so I chose the closet, which was right outside the Situation Room. And then I was trying to figure out what I was supposed to do. But I became very good friends with the White House legislative people. They could see the value of having somebody that understood foreign policy be a part of giving away the Panama Canal and various things that we did. And I did sit in pretty much on every meeting that President Carter had with members of Congress. But my first experience was one of the first things that had to be done. It was a Middle East arms sale package. And we were sitting in the cabinet room, and everybody was there. Secretary Vance and Secretary Brown and Stu Eisenstadt and you probably. I'm taking notes, and I knew that with members of Congress, and they were asking questions, and I knew that I would have to have something to do with answering the questions. So I then go back to my office, and I had a tie line to Brzezinski's line. He calls up and he says, would you come up to my office, and Secretary Brown and Secretary Vance are here. bring your notes. So I go up there and they say, how did President Carter get from this point to the other point? I thought, you guys were there. And I looked down at my notes and it was just kind of questions that Senator Javits or somebody had asked, or Senator Byrd. And I go back to my office and I thought, all right, I'm gonna get fired on my first week. So I decided then that the best defense was a good offense, and I marched up to Brzezinski and I said, excuse me, I didn't think I'd been hired as a secretary. And he said, you weren't. The rules of the government is that the lowest level person takes the notes. You clearly were the lowest level person in that office. So I learned pretty quickly.
So eventually, your former boss becomes Secretary of State, Ed Muskie. So then you have a difficult job. Your former boss is Secretary of State, your current boss is Zbig Brzezinski, but they didn't get along. So how did you navigate that?
With difficulty, because one of the things that had happened initially was that James Reston was a columnist for the New York Times, and he had interviewed Ed Muskie, and he had asked him, how are you going to get along with Brzezinski? And he actually said, it'll be fine because my former legislative assistant is up there. So putting a little pressure. And then I met quite a lot with Ed Muskie to kind of talk to him about what the job was like. But what literally happened, he called me up and he said, Madeleine, I've had it with your boss. Every time we're in the Oval Office and we're talking about something, he gives us the name of every tribe in Nigeria or wherever. And I said, he's a professor. That's what they do. So then Brzezinski called me up and he said, I can't stand it anymore. Your boss, your former boss, in principals meetings, all he does is ask questions. And I said he was a senator. That's what senators do. But then ultimately it came to be impossible because Muskie called me up and he said, I don't believe this anymore. I can't stand it. Brzezinski keeps saying he's more Polish than I am. I said he is. He has 2 Polish parents. He speaks Polish, and you don't. And so I thought I'm never going to be able to get through a second term of this.
Well, so ultimately Carter loses the election in 1980, and so a lot of the Carter people have to go get new jobs. What did you decide to do?
I decided finally to put my PhD to work, and I got a job at Georgetown University teaching in the School of Foreign Service. And it was interesting because Georgetown had been a single-sex school. They had become co-ed, and they wanted to have women professors. And so I was actually hired to be a role model, which is not a simple activity. And I had never taught. And so I began to teach, and I taught some graduate students and then undergrads, and I really liked it. I was a full-time professor.
So then in 1984, Mondale gets the nomination, and he picks as his vice presidential nominee Geraldine Ferraro. What was your involvement with that campaign?
One of the stories of my life is one thing really does lead to another. And Mondale did run for president once before. And what had happened, because I had done so much fundraising for Ed Muskie, I had gotten a call, people know Mike Berman and Dick Moe, from them saying that Fritz was running for president and would I be his fundraiser. And I was trying to make up my mind about whether to do it or not when he pulled out. So I never kind of had to make up my mind. And when I was sitting in Brzezinski's office and he was interviewing me for the job, Mondale walked in and Brzezinski said, we're thinking of hiring Madeleine for this. And he said, you can't do better. And one thing just led to another. And so Mondale, we had been very good friends when he was vice president. And when he was running for president, I was one of his foreign policy advisors. And I'd met Geraldine Ferraro first when she'd just been elected to Congress, because I did do congressional relations. And then she was chairman of the platform committee, and I was the Mondale representative to that. So then, when the convention was in San Francisco, Mondale, Jim Johnson, and people asked me to become her foreign policy advisor. So I traveled with her through the whole campaign.
All right. That campaign, not because of your advice, didn't work out. But it turns out 4 years later, you were the principal foreign policy advisor to the nominee of the party, Michael Dukakis. What was that like?
Well, let me just say, the truth is, it was very interesting to be with her because her crowds were huge. And people were fascinated by a woman candidate in national office. And she did break the glass ceiling. I mean, it was very, if people
But you didn't
remember,
think, neither of you thought you were going to win.
Yes, we thought we were going to win. I'm serious. We thought we were going to win.
Okay. All right, well, that's all right. I thought Carter was going to get reelected, so who knows?
Whatever, yeah, right.
Right.
Oh, okay.
So, all right, but in 88,
88, what did happen, which is interesting again, and when I talk to my students or young people generally, is you never know with the construct of people and how they get to know each other and how they work together. A lot of the Ferraro people were Dukakis people. So John Sasso and people had been had worked for him as governor, and they had seen me. I'd been on the plane, and I did work hard. And so I got introduced to Michael Dukakis. He couldn't have been nicer, and I had met him I had also been asked, actually Bernie Aronson's here, he had asked me to do some stuff to advance the platform committee hearings in Denver, and I'd kind of gotten to see Dukakis. And so he asked me to be his foreign policy advisor. So this is not a secret to people in this audience. Foreign policy advisors in Washington usually say, I'm advising everybody. So when it became clear that I was going with Michael Dukakis, people would say, why would you do that? I did. He was the nominee. And then I come back to Washington after the convention, and I'm a cocktail party, very popular. The National Journal says, a woman walks into the cocktail party. She's immediately surrounded by men. Is it Brooke Shields? No, it's Madeleine Albright, who these days is much more popular. But then life is a lot of ups and downs. After we lost, I'm at the Kennedy Center walking around. Some Washington lawyer comes up to me and says, you certainly effed that up. And so I kind of lost that Brooke Shields appeal.
so you then took a job as the president of the Center for National Policy, which was
Yeah.
a sort of Democratic-oriented think tank. So when Bill Clinton was running, you were not really as involved in that campaign because you were running the center. But ultimately, you headed up the transition for the National Security Council for Bill Clinton. And then did you expect to get a job in the administration?
It's interesting because all the campaigns that I didn't work in, Bill Clinton's was, and yet I had met him originally when he was doing debate prep with Michael Dukakis. And because he'd gone to Georgetown, we had kind of gotten to know each other. And then I was asked to do the transition for the NSC, and it was really weird to go back to, I had been in the White House until the last minute with President Carter, and then left and was the first Clinton person to go back to the White House. And they had fixed it up a bit, but it was very strange, and the photographs were all different. And I did work on the transition with Rick Enderfurth, and Sandy Berger was kind of an overall person on it. I had hoped to get a job. I did wish that I would get a job, but it was unclear to me whether I would get one or not. And then Sandy called me in, and he said that the president was going to offer me the ambassadorship to the UN. I knew that one of my very good friends actually had wanted the job, Dick Gardner. And the first words out of my mouth were, Dick Gardner will kill me, instead of, thank you very much. And I was waiting for it to happen officially. And so I went, nothing was happening. I went to the White House to work on a Sunday, and I kept calling my message machine. And finally, there was a message from Warren Christopher, who was in charge of the whole transition, saying, go get yourself vetted. I took my tax papers, and then he called and he said, come down to Little Rock and don't tell anybody you're coming, which was a little difficult, but that is how it happened.
Okay. So you're offered the job, you took the job, and did you find the UN job as exciting as you thought it was going to be?
I thought it was great, and it was at a fantastic time because people thought that the UN was on a new trajectory in terms of post-Cold War. The Soviet Union wasn't, and basically there were not vetoes all the time. I loved it. I thought it was absolutely terrific.
So after 4 years, President Clinton is reelected, and then Warren Christopher says, I'm going to step down as Secretary of State. So was there a lot of jockeying for that job, or nobody really wanted it?
Are you coming in from Mars?
Right.
Yeah, no. So this is what really did happen. Warren Christopher was one of the most generous people in the world, and I was a member of the Principals Committee while I was UN ambassador. It was the first time as a permanent member of it. And so he would say to me, you're an instructed ambassador, but in the Principals Committee, you have your own voice. You have to say what you think. He did make clear that he didn't want the job for a second term, and I had been on TV a lot and things. And so my name was out there. Somebody said, yeah, well, you know, it's not going to happen because Arab leaders will not deal with a woman. The Arab ambassadors at the UN kind of got together and said, we had no problem dealing with Ambassador Albright. We wouldn't have any problem dealing with Secretary Albright. So that went away. Then somebody, and I never want to know who, at the White House said, yeah, Madeleine's on the list, but she's second tier. So I didn't think it was going to happen at all. I really honestly didn't think. I was back in New York, and I get a phone call on like December 4th from Erskine Bowles saying, if the President of the United States were to call you tomorrow, would you take the call?
Right.
And if he were to ask you to be Secretary of State, would you say yes? So obviously I said yes to both, and he said, well, go home and wait for the President's call. I go home, and I was just nervous, and I'd asked Elaine Shokas, who was my chief of staff, to spend the night, and then I forgot that I was dealing with President Clinton, who didn't get up early in the morning. I was even afraid to take a bath. I was sitting there in my pink bathrobe, and I kept saying to Elaine, he's changed his mind, he's changed his mind. So finally, around 9:30, the phone rings, and they say, the White House calling, President of the United States, hold for the President. And then they put on some horrible music, and I was sure he'd changed his mind. And so then gets on, and he said, will you be my Secretary of State? And I obviously said yes. And then the question was, what was I going to wear? Which is where the red dress comes in.
So while you were being vetted to be Secretary of State, and around that time, it turned out that your parents had never told you that they had been born Jewish. And why did you think that was a potential problem?
When I became ambassador to the UN, I started getting letters from people that were in decipherable Czech or bad handwriting. And it usually said, I'm a relative, I want money and a visa. But it never had the names of the villages or the dates right. And every once in a while, there'd be something that said, you're from a Jewish family. Or then there was some, Serbs didn't exactly like me, and they said that I was just a Jewish bitch, and I decided to ignore that. Around the time that my name was out there and I was being vetted, I got a letter from somebody that had the names of all the villages right and the names of the families and dates and all that. They asked me the normal questions that I was being vetted about, taxes and nannies and various things. And then they said, we always ask this question of everybody, is there anything that we should have asked you that we didn't? And I said, well, I just got this letter, and it's perfectly possible that I'm of Jewish background. And they said, so what? The president is not anti-Semitic. And so over the holidays, I talked to my daughters about it, and they were endlessly fascinated because they thought my parents were wonderful and interesting, and the stories were so crazy anyway. Then what happened was that Michael Dobbs, a reporter for the Washington Post, wanted to do a profile of me. And you're not allowed to talk to the press between the time that you're named and the time you're confirmed. But we gave him the names of a bunch of people that he could get in touch with. 2 days after I was confirmed, he came to my office and he started handing me these disgusting cards that the Nazis kept about who they'd sent to concentration camps and some photographs. And he said, did you know this person? Did you know about this person? And I just was, there's no way to describe how I felt. And I've said this to you, David, I felt as if I'd been asked to represent our country in a marathon, the first woman to ever ask to do that, and be given not only a heavy package to carry, but unwrap at the same time. And I couldn't go to try to figure out this story myself, so I asked my brother and sister to go to the Czech Republic to begin to figure it out, and they're the ones we began to put the story together. It's taken a very long time, and last summer I went to Prague with my daughters and my 6 grandchildren to Terezín to dedicate a plaque to the 26 members of my family who died in the
Including
Holocaust.
3 of your grandparents.
Yes. Yeah.
When you were confirmed for the Senate, was it a very close vote?
99 to nothing.
Where was the other vote?
The missing person, and I've teased him about it ever since, was Jay Rockefeller, because he was traveling, you know.
So what is the greatest pleasure of being Secretary of State, and what are you most proud of what you have achieved when you were Secretary of State?
Well, I have to say, I so have believed in the goodness of America and America, what America can do. And the story of my life is that when the U.S. is not around, which it wasn't at Munich, because the British and French made an agreement with the Germans and Italians over the head of Czechoslovakia, terrible things happen. And as a little girl, I remember the military Americans coming to London, and everything changed. As a result of agreements made during World War II, Czechoslovakia was, quote, liberated by the Soviet Union, and that changed everything. The thread in my life has always been is if the U.S. is doing something good and useful, we can make a difference. I felt that way when I was at the United Nations. And so all of a sudden, to be able to have something to do with making a difference for other people with American power was what was so stunningly important to me. And when people ask me what I'm proudest of, it's Kosovo. And partially because I had been upset at how slow we were to do something about Bosnia. That's when I had my argument with Colin Powell. And then I thought, all right, when Kosovo was going on and ethnic cleansing was happening, I thought, okay, now I am Secretary of State and I can do something. And it's actually a pretty good case study in terms of getting the U.S. government to go along with it. The State Department, as we all know, can make a lot of statements, but we have no airplanes. So it really took that kind of interagency thing and then persuading NATO to do something. And the night that the airplanes start, President Clinton calls me up and he says, Madeleine, we're doing the right thing, right? Yes, Mr. President, we're doing the right thing. Then what happened was the weather was bad. The Serbs had put out some decoys, and then a couple of days later I come into my office and my exec says, sit down. And I said, what? He said, just sit down. I said, what is the matter with you? And he said, we've just bombed the Chinese embassy by mistake. So at that stage, they called it Madeleine's War, not as a compliment. Right. When we won, it was called something else. But when I go back to Kosovo now, there is a whole generation of little girls whose first name is Madeleine, and they all are so grateful for what the United States did. So that's what I'm proudest of.
And the President of the United States, one time when you were Secretary of State, revealed why he had picked you. And why did he say he picked you?
Well, and it goes back to the time of the Great Mentioning. What happened was we used to travel together, Hillary and the President and I, and we were someplace in Central America. I would introduce her, she would introduce him, and he actually said the following thing, that during that period when people were trying to make up their minds, that Hillary would come to him and she'd say, why don't you name Madeleine? She is most in tune with your views, expresses them better than anybody else, and besides, it would make your mother happy. So that is how it happened.
And when you were Secretary of State, you became famous, among other things, for wearing a pin. You have one on tonight. Why did you wear those pins, and how did you pick the pins?
Well, the pins, it was, I clearly like jewelry. So I was an instructed ambassador. The Gulf War had been translated into a series of sanctions resolutions, and my job was to make sure the sanctions stayed on. So I said perfectly terrible things about Saddam Hussein constantly. He deserved it. He'd invaded Kuwait. And so all of a sudden this poem did appear in the papers in Baghdad, comparing me to many things, but among them an unparalleled serpent. And I had a snake pin. And so I wore it whenever we talked about Iraq. And then you saw the picture. The press kind of picks it up. Why were you wearing it? So I explain it. And I thought, well, this is fun. So I went out and I bought a lot of costume jewelry to depict whatever we were going to do on any given day. So on good days, I wore flowers and butterflies and balloons, and on bad days, a lot of insects and carnivorous animals. And the other ambassadors would say, what are we going to do today? And the first President Bush had said, read my lips, no new taxes. So I said, read my pins, and that's how it started. But it got to be so funny. So for instance, you'll remember this, the Russians actually were bugging the State Department when I was secretary. And we found the guy sitting outside, and we did what diplomats do, which is to do a démarche and complain. But the next time I met with the Russian foreign minister, I wore a very large bug, and he knew exactly what I was signaling.
So for those who want to know more about Madeleine's life, we've run out of time tonight. She's written 3 excellent books. One is Madam Secretary, about her life. Excellent book, very well written, and very frank. second book about Prague winter, about her growing up in Czechoslovakia, and a book about pins, which tells you how she picked her pins and a lot about them. And on behalf of the American people, I'd like to thank you for your service to our country. And I'd like to say you've received a lot of awards, including the Presidential Medal of Freedom. We'd like to give you one award, additional one tonight, if we could. Thank you for your service.
Thank you. And can I thank you very much, and all of you, for giving me this honor, because people ask me what is the most important thing that ever happened to me. Becoming an American, hands down. And I truly am a grateful American. And the opportunity to sit behind a sign that says the United States and be able to represent this country has been the greatest possible honor. And I do think this is an exceptional country in so many ways. And thank you very, very much. And to be your friend, David, also.
Thank you very much, Madeleine.
Thank
now,
you.
the Secretary, John. Thank you. Great. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
Wow, that was a lot.
That was good.
It was good. It was really good. I learned a lot more about her and what she's gone through and how she's been so influential to our country in different ways.
Yeah, she really has. And, you know, I didn't realize she was an immigrant. So that's really fascinating. And then just her whole family history was really interesting. All the things that they overcame, you know, and then the things she overcame as a woman, and then being an older woman, you know. A lot of people act like, you know, as you get older, you know, your career's over, but she's someone to model your life after and to look forward to, you know, being an older person and still having an influential or being an influence in your position.
Definitely.